course, you can print your fonts out using a printer, but for today's little exercise, gone the good old-fashioned way using pencil and paper. So I've sped up the video for this part because, yeah, I'm sure we all know how to draw. The important thing for me for this project was to keep my lettering the same size. So to do that, I've given myself some guidelines and I'm working with those. The other important thing to remember for today's project anyway is that because I've got duplicate letters in the word subscribe, there's 2 S's and 2 B's, I only have to write one of those letters down because I'm going to be cutting out my letters and using them as templates to draw around. I've learned over the years to do just little arrows to indicate to myself which direction the letters go. I know this might sound a bit silly, but especially if you're doing a long word, it's always a good idea just to help yourself by giving yourself these little guidelines. So I'm using a craft knife or a box cutter to get onto the inside parts of my letters and the letters R and B. You could of course get the same thing with a small pair of scissors. It's really important to measure out the length of your word and the gaps between the letters to make sure that your background fabric is big enough. Ironing everything might seem tedious, but it's incredibly important, especially if you're not using any applique paper or hemming tape, to make sure that all of your fabrics are completely straight, to make sure there's no bubbling in the fabrics when you're stitching them down. Use your water erasable marker or chalk, a thin chalk, to draw your letters onto your fabric. You need to think carefully about how you're going to be placing your letters on your background fabric, because especially if you're not using any kind of applique paper or hemming tape to stick your letters down, then you need to make sure that the weave of your applique fabric and the weave of your background fabric match. This is obviously if you're using woven fabrics here. This is very, very important, because if you've got one going at 45-degree angle and the other one's at a 90-degree angle, you're going to end up with bubbles and your fabrics are going to warp. So in order to keep your fabrics dead straight, your stitching dead straight, you need to make sure that the weaves always match. Whenever possible, make sure that you've got a lot of extra space around where you're working. This just gives you an extra bit of fabric to grip onto and hold while you're moving your fabric around as you're stitching. And also prevents it, just in case your background fabric does tend to fray a lot. It just gives you that extra bit of wiggle room, so to speak. So we set up our machine for free motion embroidery in order to go do our initial round of stitching on the letters. If you need a recap, there's a link in the description to how you set your machine up for free motion embroidery. But just to go through the very basics, you've got your embroidery foot on, and you've got your feed dogs are disengaged, they've dropped down, and your machine is set to a straight stitch. You want to go as close to the edge as possible, but yeah, don't worry too much as long as you're catching the fabric onto your applique, the fabric you're appliquing onto the background fabric, you're fine, because you're going to go over all of this stitch is going to be covered by your satin stitch. A little point to remember is trying to make the thread that you're using now to do the free motion embroidery on the outside, try and get that thread color as close to the fabric that you're appliquing as possible. So that way when you're going over with your satin stitch, you're not having to cover up a contrasting thread. Handy little trick that I've picked up over the years. So if you want to get to the inside of a design and you don't necessarily want to stop and start your threads, move your fabric as little as possible in order to get your needle to the position it needs to be in, because you don't want to create any loops of thread at the back of your fabric. Then you use your scissors or a pen or your finger and you just hold that top thread. You make a loop with the top thread and hold it tight and then stitch around where you want it to be. So this will create a big loop of thread on the top that you can then trim off afterwards, and underneath the back of your work will remain quite neat. So it just helps to get to those little inside bits without having to stop and start and move your fabric each time. So when you've finished all your free motion embroidery, remember to trim your threads really well. So that when you're going over it with your satin stitch, you're creating as neat an edge as possible. So to set up your machine for satin stitch, you need to take off the free motion embroidery foot that you've put onto place for your previous step. And you need to make sure that you re-engage the feed dogs. You put on the original foot back onto the machine, and then you're going to change the actual little foot piece to the satin stitch foot if you have one. If not, you can continue to use the normal sewing foot. It's normally called foot J. That's up to you. The satin stitch foot does make it a bit easier because it's got the little groove at the bottom, and that groove allows you to go over the stitching nice and easily. But like I said, I've done plenty of work with just using the ordinary foot. It's really important to remember to put up your feed dogs, otherwise your fabric's not going to be going anywhere and you're going to get very stuck. Next is going to be the basic setup of your machine, which is a zigzag stitch. If you have a setting for buttonhole that allows you to do straight lines of satin stitch, then set it to the buttonhole setting. Otherwise, set it to a stitch length somewhere between 0 and 1. The width will be determined by the fabric that you're appliquing down, and you want your tension slightly lower than normal to make sure that your top threads are always pulled to underneath your fabric. Right, so just a little side note on setting up the needle for the zigzag. So you want to make sure that when you're stitching, use your hand wheel to determine this, that make sure that your needle, the outer edge of the zigzag, falls flush with the outer edge of the fabric, and the bulk of the stitching is going over the fabric that you're appliquing. That'll give you that additional strength and make sure that it doesn't fray from here. So you want to make sure that your needle is on this outer edge. Another thing to add is when you are going on your straight lines, always go up to the very end of the fabric that you're appliquing down. Stop, turn your fabric, and then do your first 1 or 2 stitches with the hand wheel to make sure that your next line of stitching lines up nicely with that one. On how to prevent any gaps in your stitching. So this is for when you're going around a curve. You want to make sure, so as you're stitching, you'll see that your stitches, as you're sewing, you'll see that your stitches start to form sideways like that. So you need to stop your machine with your needle in the outer edge of your fabric, shift your fabric, and then make sure that your next line of stitches cross over your previous line. That way you don't get any gaps. So if you're going on an inner curve, you would do it obviously the opposite direction. But you always want to make sure that the bottom of your new stitches are forming over the base of the old stitches. That way there's no gaps in how you're sewing. So just to show you in a real life example. So here you're stitching, you stop your needle on the curve here, shift your fabric like so, and then you continue to stitch. Same thing here, you shift your fabric and continue to stitch. That way you don't get any gaps. The other thing, just to show you, is that when you're moving your fabric to go around your curves, always make sure you do your first few stitches, your first 1 or 2 stitches with the hand wheel to make sure that you've lined it up correctly. Because if you look here on this little C, I didn't do that. I just for a moment forgot and didn't line up my stitching, and then you end up with this weird discrepancy here. This is easy enough to fix with the second line of stitching going around it, but I've left it like this just to be able to show you why using a hand wheel to position your first few stitches is so important, because you can quite easily go wrong and just a few millimeters can make a big difference. And now back to our project. So we've got everything set up. Let's begin stitching. As always, you take your first stitch using the hand wheel, and that way you can pull your bottom thread to the top just by gently tugging on your top thread. You want to make your first few stitches, you want to be covering over those 2 little threads that you've just pulled up, just to secure those completely, so that when time comes you can just trim them off neatly and you don't have to worry about them coming undone. It's important when it comes to satin stitch to let the machine do what it needs to do. You can't move your fabric any faster, you can't make it sew any faster. It needs to go at its own pace so that the stitches are neat and even and they are covering the fabric as you want them to work. So don't try and rush this, just be patient and work slowly and carefully. Also, just to add that I'm not, because I'm using quite thick denim and the fabric that I'm appliquing down is quite thick cotton, haven't used any form of backing fabric or iron-on interfacing to strengthen either of my fabrics, but this is just purely because of my background fabric being such thick denim. So you might want to, or you possibly need to put on an iron-on interfacing on the back of your fabric, and even using an embroidery hoop can also make your work much neater. If you're wanting to create a very solid line of stitching, then there's another technique you could use. That's after you've done your free motion embroidery to get your stitches, your fabrics to lay completely flat, you do your first round of zigzag satin stitch with a much narrower stitch width than you want your final stitching to be. So, for example, you would go around your lettering with on your width as number 3, and then you'd go over it again with your width at a number 5, and this will create a sort of raised edge, a raised ridge of stitching, shall I say, and also create a very neat line of stitching as well. So it just obviously takes quite a lot of time to do your work, but it'll create a very solid, very neat line of stitching. So you just want to continue going around your letters in this way. Remember, be calm, be patient. It takes a while for the machine to do the stitching, but your patience will pay off. And just remember to try and, when you're starting a letter, to allow your first few stitches to cover your initial starting threads and then trim them off neatly. And I find it easiest to trim the threads as I go, but that's entirely up to you how you'd like to do that. When you've finished all your satin stitching, you want to trim your threads as neatly as possible. So always remember that if this is if you've done your embroidery on an item that's going to be worn, then you need to pull your threads to the back of the work and tie yourselves in a little granny or a square knot, something that's not going to come undone. As my work today is purely for display purposes, I can cut my threads flush with my fabric. And here we have our final product. So please do subscribe and like this video. And if you have any questions, please put them in the comments below. Thanks for watching.